In the summer of 1943, deep in the chaos of the Eastern Front, a strange weapon fell into German hands. It wasn't a tank, a plane, or a new type of shell. It was something far simpler: a tube, a rocket, and a trigger. To the men who found it, it looked like a child's toy. But when they saw what it could do, their laughter stopped instantly. It was called the M1A1 Bazooka, the American shoulder-fired rocket launcher that would change infantry warfare forever. The story began months earlier in North Africa. American troops had brought the bazooka into combat against German armor for the first time in 1942. Its principle was shockingly simple. A soldier could carry a weapon capable of destroying a tank. No artillery, no heavy crew, just a man and a tube that spat fire. German tank crews at first dismissed reports of these weapons as exaggerations. Infantry destroying panzers? Impossible. They trusted in their thick armor, especially on machines like the Panzer IV and Tiger. But on the battlefields of Tunisia and Sicily, they began to notice something alarming. Tanks weren't being hit by shells. They were being burned from the sides, their armor punctured by molten copper jets. One German officer later wrote, "Our tanks were being slain by ghosts." There was no sound, no gun, only a streak of fire, and the armor melted. That streak of fire was the American bazooka in action, a lightweight anti-tank rocket that used a shaped charge to focus explosive energy into a narrow point. The result, armor that once seemed invincible was no longer safe. When German engineers finally got their hands on one, captured intact in late 1942 near North Africa, they couldn't believe how crude it appeared. Two wires, a trigger, and a simple open tube. It had no recoil, no complex sighting system, and could be built cheaply from basic steel and wiring. At first, they thought it must be a field improvisation. But when they saw the rocket, the HEAT warhead with its conical copper liner, they realized they were looking at something revolutionary. This was no accident. This was science turned into simplicity. The weapon was quickly sent back to Germany for study, first to the Heereswaffenamt, the Army Weapons Office, then to engineers at Hugo Schneider AG, known as HASAG, one of the Reich's largest munitions firms. Within weeks, teams were disassembling, sketching, and analyzing every wire and weld of the captured weapon. What they discovered would shock them. The Americans had mastered not just design, but efficiency. The launcher could be built in factories without advanced materials, and the ammunition could be mass-produced in huge numbers. The Germans had been developing anti-tank rifles and magnetic mines, weapons that required proximity and precision. But this was different. A man could now kill a tank from 100 meters away safely with a single rocket. The reaction was immediate. Orders came directly from the top. Reproduce it, improve it, deploy it. The engineers called their project Ofenrohr, the stovepipe. It would soon evolve into one of the most feared infantry weapons of the war, the Panzerschreck, or tank terror. But first, they needed to understand how it worked, and how the Americans had achieved what German science had failed to create. The captured bazooka had revealed a terrifying truth to the German military. The era of the tank's invulnerability was over. But what they were about to create, from that simple tube and rocket, would become even deadlier. When the captured American bazooka arrived in Germany, it was treated not as a curiosity, but as a breakthrough. At the Heereswaffenamt testing grounds, engineers and officers gathered around it like surgeons over an alien specimen. The Americans had given them a weapon that defied everything they thought they knew about infantry firepower. One of the first engineers to examine it reportedly said, "It looks like something a factory apprentice could build, but it can kill a tiger." That sentence rippled through the room. They began by dismantling it completely. The electrical firing mechanism, so simple it could have been made in a garage, fascinated them. It used dry cell batteries and a switch to ignite the rocket's propellant. Crude but ingenious. The launch tube was thin, almost fragile by German standards, yet strong enough to contain the backblast. The rocket itself was the true marvel, a shaped charge that directed its explosive force into a narrow jet capable of melting through armor. The concept was known. German scientists had experimented with Hohlladung, or hollow charge, warheads before. But what stunned them was how efficiently the Americans had weaponized it. The bazooka wasn't designed for perfection, it was designed for production. In early 1943, at the Kummersdorf Proving Grounds, German engineers conducted their first live-fire tests. They mounted the captured launcher on a tripod, aimed it at a Panzer III hull, and fired. The rocket struck the armor and melted straight through. The observers stood in silence. Then came the orders. Immediate replication. Within weeks, prototypes of a German copy began to appear. They called it the 8.8 centimeter Raketenwerfer 43, codenamed Pupchen at first, later evolving into the infamous Panzerschreck. The German version was larger, heavier, and deadlier. Its 88 mm rocket carried more explosive power than the American 60 mm round. But there was a catch. The first test firings nearly burned the operators. The rocket's backblast and smoke were so intense that soldiers suffered burns to their faces. To fix this, the engineers added a blast shield, a metal plate in front of the firer's face, and modified the firing system. The result was a weapon that could destroy almost any Allied tank of the time, including the Sherman and even the Churchill. By late 1943, the Panzerschreck had entered mass production. It was longer and more powerful than the American bazooka, but everyone knew where its roots lay. The idea, the inspiration, the design, all had come from the simple tube captured in North Africa. One German report even admitted, "This weapon is a product of American genius. We have only improved upon it." The irony was sharp. A weapon designed by the Allies to stop German tanks was now being turned against them. The hunters had learned from their prey. And as the war ground on, the Panzerschreck began to appear on every front, in the hands of soldiers who had once laughed at the idea that a man could destroy a tank. But behind its success was a darker truth, one that would reveal itself as the front lines shifted and Germany's factories began to collapse under Allied bombing. The Germans had copied the bazooka, yes, but could they match the system that made it possible? By mid-1943, the German military had something new in its arsenal. The Panzerschreck, born from a captured American bazooka. But while the weapon itself was a success, it exposed a truth that German engineers had long tried to deny. The Allies' strength was not in innovation alone, but in production. The Americans could make thousands of bazookas every month, stamped, welded, and shipped in crates across the Atlantic. The Germans, despite their brilliance, struggled to produce even hundreds. Their factories were precise but not fast. Their weapons were masterpieces, but each one took time, labor, and resources that Germany was running out of. At the Rheinmetall-Borsig facility in Sömmerda, teams worked around the clock to convert the captured design into a weapon fit for German infantry. The process was chaotic. Steel was scarce, copper wiring limited, and explosives tightly rationed. Engineers substituted parts, improvised, and adapted, turning the bazooka's American simplicity into a German necessity. The Panzerschreck they built was not elegant, but it worked. Its 88 mm rocket carried a shaped charge capable of penetrating over 200 millimeters of armor, enough to destroy even the latest Allied tanks. But it was also heavy, nearly 2 meters long, and cumbersome to carry through forests or cities. When it first appeared on the Eastern Front, Soviet tank crews learned to fear it immediately. The weapon gave German infantry the power to stop the seemingly endless waves of T-34s that had overrun them since Stalingrad. One shot, well placed, could reduce a tank to a burning wreck. A Wehrmacht report from early 1944 described its effect in blunt terms. Where once a company needed guns to halt armor, now 2 men can do the work of 10. But the Panzerschreck came at a cost. It produced a massive backblast that revealed the shooter's position instantly. The blast shield helped, but not enough. Many soldiers refused to fire it from enclosed positions for fear of the heat and smoke. It was powerful and dangerous to use. Despite its flaws, the weapon spread fast. Units from Normandy to the Eastern Front received shipments. Each came with simple instructions: aim at the lower hull, fire, move. Training was minimal. The weapon's simplicity made it almost foolproof. And yet among the German ranks, a strange respect grew for the enemy who had inspired it. Soldiers joked that The Americans built it for us first. But among the engineers, there was no laughter, only realization. They had spent years designing complex systems, guided missiles, heavy tanks, jet aircraft. But here was proof that simplicity could win wars. The bazooka had revealed something the Germans had forgotten in their obsession with superiority, practicality. The Americans had built a weapon any soldier could use. It required no special training, no complex machinery, just courage and a steady aim. As one German engineer later wrote, "We were taught that brilliance wins wars, but the Americans taught us that efficiency does." But while the Panzerschreck gave the German infantry a new sense of hope, it arrived too late to change the course of the war. The Allies were already preparing for the next phase, the invasion of Western Europe. And when their armies came ashore, they brought with them not only thousands of bazookas, but something even deadlier. June 6, 1944. The beaches of Normandy erupted in fire and steel. Allied forces stormed ashore, wave after wave, carrying everything they would need to fight their way across Europe. Rifles, tanks, and thousands of bazookas. For the German defenders hidden in the bunkers of Omaha, Juno, and Sword Beach, it was the first time they faced the full fury of the Allied arsenal. Among the chaos of the invasion, the American bazooka revealed its true purpose, not as an experimental weapon, but as a tool of survival. Infantrymen used it to disable machine gun nests, destroy bunkers, and even fight tanks at point-blank range. To the Germans who survived those battles, it became clear. This small, crude launcher was changing the face of warfare. In Berlin, reports from the front poured into the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. Commanders demanded more Panzerschrecks, more men trained to use them. The weapon had proven its worth, but production could not keep up. Allied bombing raids crippled factories, supply lines were shattered, and the raw materials were gone. At the same time, German intelligence captured more American weapons on the Western Front. New versions of the bazooka, lighter and more efficient. Engineers studied them feverishly, noting every change. Improved triggers, better rocket stabilization, simpler wiring. The Americans were not standing still. Every week, their designs evolved, while Germany struggled to build enough to survive. One engineer at Rheinmetall later admitted, "The bazooka was not advanced, but it was alive. It changed faster than we could react." That realization terrified the German high command. For years, they had believed their technological superiority could offset the Allies' numbers. But the bazooka, and the weapons inspired by it, proved otherwise. Innovation alone was useless without speed, supply, and simplicity. The Panzerschreck continued to evolve in the field. Soldiers modified them with improvised sights, wooden stands, even cloth covers to hide the flash. The weapon became an icon of last-ditch defense, appearing in every major battle from Normandy to the fall of Berlin. In the ruins of Caen, German troops used Panzerschrecks to ambush Allied tanks among collapsed buildings. The rockets could turn even narrow city streets into deadly traps. For the first time since 1940, German infantry could fight armor on nearly equal terms. But it was never enough. The Allies brought overwhelming firepower, air superiority, and endless replacements. Every tank destroyed was followed by two more. Every position held was eventually overrun. By the autumn of 1944, Germany's war machine was collapsing. The Panzerschreck was now in the hands of boys and old men. The Volkssturm, Germany's final militia. They were given little training and even less hope. To them, the weapon was both a lifeline and a death sentence. Many died before they could even fire a shot. But those who did often took Allied armor with them. Grim proof of the weapon's power. A U.S. officer after the war described it best. "We respected the Panzerschreck. It could kill any tank we had, but it couldn't stop the tide." In a cruel twist of irony, the weapon that had given the Germans one last spark of resistance was born from the ingenuity of their enemies. The bazooka had turned into its mirror image, the Panzerschreck, a weapon both brilliant and tragic. The Germans had copied it instantly, but they could never copy the system that produced it. By early 1945, the Panzerschreck had become a symbol of desperation. Across the Eastern Front, in the burning cities of Poland and East Prussia, German soldiers clutched the weapon as their last hope against the endless columns of Soviet armor. The Red Army rolled westward with unstoppable momentum, thousands of T-34 tanks leading the charge. German infantry, outnumbered and exhausted, turned to the Panzerschreck like a talisman. They hid in ruins, snowbanks, and forests, waiting for the moment to strike. When the moment came, they fired, and the effect was devastating. Soviet tank crews described the horror of seeing their machines pierced by invisible fire. The shaped charge warhead of the Panzerschreck could burn through nearly every tank in the Soviet arsenal. For a fleeting moment, the Germans had regained parity on the battlefield. A single well-aimed rocket could turn a Soviet advance into chaos. But there was a cost. Firing the weapon exposed its user to danger. The exhaust flame was blindingly bright, and without proper shields, many operators were burned or revealed instantly to enemy fire. Despite its flaws, the Panzerschreck was brutally effective. Soviet commanders began ordering their infantry to advance alongside tanks to neutralize German anti-tank teams. It became a deadly dance. Armor versus courage, steel versus human resolve. In one report from the Battle of Königsberg, Soviet officers noted, "Every house may hide a Panzerschreck. Every shadow may burn." Meanwhile, in the West, the Allies pushed into Germany. They, too, faced the Panzerschreck's fury in places like Aachen, Hürtgen Forest, and the Ardennes. American tank crews grew wary of narrow streets and dense woods, where the weapon's 88mm rocket could strike from ambush. But as the war neared its end, the balance of power had already shifted beyond repair. Germany's factories lay in ruins. The weapons that once came from precision assembly lines were now built in cellars and schools, sometimes without proper materials. The mighty Panzerschreck was being made by hand, a ghost of its former efficiency. One engineer, writing in a final report from Magdeburg in April 1945, said quietly, "We can still build weapons, but we can no longer build victory." Those words captured the tragedy of Germany's war effort. The Panzerschreck, born from the captured American Bazooka, had outgrown its inspiration and power, but not in purpose. It could destroy tanks, but it could not save a collapsing empire. The irony was almost poetic. A weapon born from imitation had become one of the few that truly terrified the Allies. Yet its creation was a reminder of Germany's fatal weakness, the inability to adapt fast enough. Where the Americans built simplicity, Germany built complexity. Where the Americans mass-produced, Germany refined. The result was inevitable. The War of Invention had been lost long before the final battles began. By the final days of April 1945, Berlin was surrounded. In the rubble of the capital, teenage soldiers armed with Panzerschrecks waited for Soviet tanks that would crush what remained of the Reich. They fired until their rockets ran out, until their city turned to dust. The Panzerschreck, copied, improved, and wielded with desperation, became the weapon of Germany's last stand. As the spring of 1945 unfolded, the Panzerschreck became both a symbol of defiance and of futility. In the ruins of Berlin, German soldiers, many of them barely older than boys, crouched behind piles of rubble, clutching the heavy launchers. Their faces were covered in soot, their uniforms ragged, yet their eyes were steady. The weapon in their hands was one of the few that could still strike fear into the enemy. The Soviets advanced street by street, their T-34s leading the charge, supported by waves of infantry. Every corner of the city turned into a battlefield. From basements and doorways, Panzerschreck teams waited, hidden in the smoke and debris. When the tanks appeared, they fired, fire and thunder erupting in narrow alleys. For a few brief seconds, the weapon gave them the illusion of power. A direct hit could turn a tank into a blazing inferno. Soviet crews often had no warning, only the hiss of the rocket, then the impact that ripped through steel. But for every tank destroyed, 10 more rolled forward. The Panzerschreck was powerful, but it couldn't change fate. The Soviets adapted quickly, sending infantry ahead to clear buildings and using artillery to pound suspected ambush positions into dust. The once proud weapon, born from American ingenuity and German precision, had become a tool of survival, not strategy. Inside Germany's collapsing war machine, engineers still sent reports suggesting improvements to the weapon's design. Some proposed lighter versions or new sighting mechanisms, but it was too late. There was no fuel, no factories, no time. The Panzerschreck had done all it could. When the battle for Berlin ended in May 1945, thousands of Panzerschrecks were left scattered among the ruins. Many were buried, others captured by the Soviets and Americans. A few were shipped back to Allied test centers for analysis. A fitting irony, the weapon that began as an American invention, copied by Germany, now returned to Allied hands for study. One American ordnance officer examining a captured Panzerschreck in 1945 remarked, "They made it better, but they didn't make it enough." Indeed, the Panzerschreck was technically superior to the Bazooka. Its warhead was larger, its penetration deeper, but it was also heavier, bulkier, and more dangerous to use. The Bazooka, though smaller, remained far more practical for the fast-moving, supply-driven warfare the Allies mastered. The Germans, obsessed with improvement, had created a weapon too refined for the desperate chaos they were trapped in. Yet even in defeat, the Panzerschreck left its mark. The concept of a man-portable anti-tank rocket had proven decisive. After the war, militaries around the world, including the Soviets, studied it closely. It became the blueprint for future generations of anti-tank weapons, from the RPG to modern guided systems. The weapon that began as a captured curiosity had changed warfare forever. For the German engineers who first studied the American bazooka in 1943, it had started as a puzzle, a strange little tube that spat fire. Within 2 years, it became their last hope. And when the war ended, they realized the cruel truth. They had copied the weapon perfectly, but not the world that made it possible. Because in the end, innovation alone was never enough. It was the system, the logistics, the factories, the scale that determined victory. The Panzerschreck had proven one final lesson, that even genius cannot save a nation that's already running out of time. When the war ended, the story of the Panzerschreck didn't end with it. Across Germany's shattered cities, Allied forces collected the remnants of the Reich's technology, rockets, blueprints, and prototypes. Among them were hundreds of Panzerschrecks, stacked like firewood in captured depots. To the Americans and British, the weapon was both familiar and unsettling. They recognized its origins, and they recognized its improvements. In Allied reports, one phrase appeared again and again: based on the U.S. bazooka, improved by the Germans. Engineers studying the weapon noted the larger 88mm warhead, the better penetration, the shield that protected the operator from backblast. They admired the precision of its sights, the efficiency of its rocket motor. But they also saw the flaws: the weight, the danger of misfire, the smoke that exposed its position. It was in many ways a perfect reflection of Germany's wartime engineering, brilliant but burdened by complexity. In post-war interviews, captured German engineers spoke candidly about the weapon's origins. One recalled, "We did not invent the Panzerschreck. We perfected what we found. It was American, but it became German in its precision." Another admitted with a bitter smile, "We were not ashamed to copy. We were ashamed we had to." To them, the Panzerschreck was more than a weapon. It was a symbol of how far Germany had fallen. The Reich that once boasted of superiority had been reduced to imitation. In the years that followed, the Panzerschreck became a subject of study around the world. The Soviets took captured examples and used them as inspiration for their new anti-tank weapons, leading eventually to the RPG-2 and RPG-7. The Americans refined their own bazooka into more powerful models, learning from the lessons of both design philosophies, simplicity and strength. The Cold War would soon be filled with descendants of that first humble tube, born on the battlefields of Tunisia and perfected in the ruins of Berlin. But in Germany itself, the Panzerschreck became a relic. The men who had carried it, soldiers, engineers, and conscripts, rarely spoke of it. To many, it represented both ingenuity and desperation, the grim final chapter of a nation's fight against the inevitable. One former soldier, interviewed decades later, said quietly, "It was powerful, yes, but when you fired it, the world went white. You couldn't see, you couldn't breathe, and you always wondered, would you live long enough to reload?" Historians would later point out the irony. The Panzerschreck, born from a captured American weapon, had in turn inspired nearly every portable anti-tank launcher that followed. It was a cycle of imitation, refinement, and rediscovery. The lessons learned in those desperate years of war would shape military design for generations. Yet in the silence that followed the war, one truth remained unspoken. The weapon that symbolized defiance had been built on borrowed ideas. For all its power, the Panzerschreck was never truly German, nor American. It was a creation of necessity, born in the crucible of war, where survival mattered more than pride. And in that sense, it stood as a monument not to victory, but to adaptation. The desperate brilliance of men trying to find one more advantage in a war they were already losing. By the late months of 1944, the Panzerschreck had become a common sight on the German front lines. From the hedgerows of France to the frozen ruins of East Prussia, it was the weapon of the desperate. Entire battalions of Volkssturm, civilians turned soldiers, were handed these launchers and told they could stop a tank. Most had no training, no discipline, and little chance of survival. But still, they fired. For the engineers who designed it, this was never the plan. The Panzerschreck had been built for trained crews, men who understood cover, range, and timing. But by 1945, Germany was running on fumes. Boys barely old enough to shave were carrying launchers almost as tall as themselves. Each round was a gamble, a hope that one lucky shot could hold back the tide of tanks rolling toward Berlin. Reports from the front were brutal. The weapon was devastating at close range, capable of punching through even the thick armor of a Sherman or a T-34. But firing it came at a cost. The rocket's backblast could scorch uniforms, blind operators, and give away positions instantly. Many soldiers were killed not by enemy fire, but by their own weapons' smoke. In one letter recovered after the war, a German soldier wrote, "They told us it was the wonder weapon, but it burns like hell when you fire it. My comrade lost his sight. We destroyed a tank. Yes, but at what price?" That was the tragedy of the Panzerschreck, a weapon both feared and feared by those who used it. It could destroy steel, but it destroyed courage too. Every shot was a reminder of how far Germany had fallen, from offensive might to desperate defense. Meanwhile, in Allied intelligence circles, the weapon drew intense interest. British and American units captured hundreds of launchers and sent them for testing. The verdict was unanimous. It was effective, terrifyingly so. Allied tank crews learned to fear the long tube carried by German infantry. Training manuals were updated. Infantry were ordered to suppress any soldier carrying what looked like a Panzerschreck. Ironically, the weapon's origin, copied from an American bazooka, had now come full circle. The Allies were studying their own creation, reborn through German hands to defend against it. In the laboratories back home, engineers on both sides began thinking the same thing. If this much power could be carried by one man, what came next? The idea of portable anti-tank warfare, once a novelty, was now a doctrine. The Panzerschreck had proven that infantry could face armor and win, but it had also shown how dangerous that balance could become. The weapon had rewritten the rules of combat, not through innovation, but through desperation. To the German engineers who first tested the bazooka years earlier, this evolution was bittersweet. They had admired the simplicity of the American weapon, the clever use of electricity, the lightweight and ease of use. Now their own version, heavier, deadlier, and improved, had become a weapon of last resort. In their notebooks, they wrote less about design and more about consequence. One note, found in a captured German engineering report, simply read, "The weapon works perfectly. The nation that uses it does not." And as the war dragged toward its inevitable end, even the engineers knew that no weapon, not even one copied from their enemy, could save what was already lost. The Panzerschreck had done its job. It had terrified tank crews and inspired future generations of weapons. But it had also become a symbol of futility, a weapon born too late and used too often by those who never should have had to hold it. By early 1945, as the Third Reich crumbled, the Panzerschreck had become both an icon and an omen. On propaganda posters, it was hailed as the tank terror, the miracle weapon that could stop Allied armor dead in its tracks. But on the front lines, it was something else entirely. A symbol of how desperation had replaced strategy and how borrowed ideas could no longer save a dying empire. In Berlin's underground bunkers, engineers continued to refine the design. They added blast shields, simplified the wiring, and improved the propellant to reduce backblast. The goal was to make it safer, easier, and faster to use. But no amount of engineering could change the truth on the ground. Germany no longer had the fuel, the metal, or the manpower to sustain the war. The Panzerschreck, born from imitation, had reached perfection too late. The Allied armies had adapted. Their tanks now came with thicker frontal armor, better tactics, and close infantry support to eliminate Panzerschreck teams before they could fire. In a cruel twist, the weapon that once terrified the Allies was now becoming obsolete before the war had even ended. Yet the legacy of the Panzerschreck was not fading, it was evolving. The British introduced the P-1AT, the Americans refined the Bazooka, and the Soviets began developing the RPG series that would dominate battlefields for decades to come. The age of anti-tank infantry weapons had arrived, and it all began with a single American prototype, captured, studied, and transformed by the enemy. In a sense, it was the ultimate irony of war. Invention by necessity, progress by imitation. The German engineers who had first tested the bazooka back in 1942 never intended to copy it blindly. They admired it. They respected its simplicity and adaptability, qualities often overlooked by German design philosophy, which prized complexity and precision above all else. The bazooka showed them another way to think. A weapon didn't have to be perfect. It only had to work. And that revelation, as small as a steel tube and as powerful as a tank, would outlive the war itself. After the surrender, Allied intelligence teams scoured German laboratories and weapons depots. Among the piles of prototypes and blueprints, they found Panzerschrecks in every form. Short, long, modified, even experimental versions meant for vehicles. American and British engineers studied them in turn, just as the Germans had once studied the bazooka. It was as if the two sides were locked in an endless cycle of learning from one another, each war feeding the next with lessons written in steel and smoke. One American officer who examined a captured Panzerschreck at Aberdeen Proving Ground wrote, "They improved it. Heavier, yes, but smarter. It's strange. They made our weapon deadlier than we ever could." In the years that followed, the lessons of the Panzerschreck would quietly shape the modern battlefield. Engineers realized that mobility and firepower could now exist in a single soldier's hands. No longer would tanks rule unchallenged. They had met their equal in the simplest of weapons, a man with a launcher. The world had entered a new era, the age of portable power. And yet behind that revolution was a story of irony and humility. The Panzerschreck had begun not as a German innovation, but as an American one. The engineers who had once laughed at the crude design of the bazooka had ended up copying it. And in doing so, they had unknowingly paved the way for a new chapter in warfare. They had learned a truth that would outlast every weapon they built, that sometimes the simplest ideas are the hardest to defeat. When the war finally ended in 1945 and the fires of Europe cooled, the story of the Panzerschreck and the bazooka seemed like just another footnote in a war filled with weapons. But for engineers and soldiers alike, it carried a deeper meaning, one that went far beyond steel and gunpowder. Because in that brief moment of imitation, in the desperate copying of a captured weapon, two worlds of engineering philosophy collided and changed the future of warfare forever. In the ruins of Germany, Allied officers cataloged captured technology, jet engines, rockets, missiles, all trophies of a nation that had reached for technological dominance. Among them, in crates and workshops, they found hundreds of Panzerschrecks. Some were pristine, others battered from battle. Each one told a story, not of genius alone, but of adaptation. The Americans studied the design closely. Its larger caliber, improved propellant, and better warhead became the basis for post-war bazooka models. Within a few years, those lessons helped create the M20 Super Bazooka used in Korea and beyond. In a quiet irony, the German copy had now influenced the original, completing the circle. Historians would later look back on the Panzerschreck as a symbol of wartime pragmatism, the moment when ideology gave way to necessity. It was not a weapon born from pride, but from survival. The German engineers at the Kummersdorf proving grounds had seen the bazooka in action, understood its simplicity, and acted with speed that surprised even their own command. Within months, they had built a weapon that would arm an entire army, one that could stop a tank with a single soldier. In a war that had consumed millions of lives, that was a kind of power the world had never seen before. For the Allies, the Panzerschreck served as a grim reminder of how quickly knowledge could cross enemy lines. For the Germans, it became a symbol of both ingenuity and irony, proof that even in defeat, they had learned from those they once mocked. One post-war engineer, when asked about the weapon, said simply, "It taught us humility. The Americans taught us that strength is not in complexity, but in clarity." The men who built the Panzerschreck faded into history, their names forgotten, their work overshadowed by greater machines. The V-2 rocket, the jet fighter, the Tiger tank. But in a quiet way, their creation outlived them all. The concept of a shoulder-fired anti-tank weapon became a foundation for generations to come, from the American law to the Soviet RPG. Each one carried a bit of that wartime inheritance. The idea that one person, armed with the right tool, could challenge even the most powerful machine. It was a humbling lesson for both sides. The Americans had invented it, the Germans had refined it, and together they had unknowingly shaped the future of warfare, a future where mobility and simplicity ruled. As one Allied officer later wrote in his field report, "In their hands our weapon came back to us stronger." But by then the war was already lost. For them, and perhaps for all of us who believed machines could solve everything. The bazooka and the Panzerschreck began as enemies, born on opposite sides of a battlefield. But their legacy became one and the same, proof that innovation knows no borders and that even in the darkest times, ideas cross lines that armies cannot. The German engineers had laughed at the crude American tube they found in the desert, but in the end, it was that very tube, simple, effective, unstoppable, that changed the way the world fought. And so the story ends, not with fire or triumph, but with understanding. Because sometimes the greatest weapon of all is not invention, but the willingness to learn. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more World War II stories.